Welcome back to Love the System, the integral stage series devoted to politics, procedures, protocols, processes, and the possibilities of systemic progress. I'm one of those Layman Pascals you've heard about, and today we're joined by conservative, gay, integrally informed Christian pastor and political operative Rich Tafel, log cabin Republican and a driving force behind the American project to reimagine communitarian conservatism. Maybe he'll be able to help us understand the pragmatic dimension of post-postmodern political change, the spiritual dimension of the American zeitgeist, and the opportunities for a hybrid of healthy, progressive, and conservative values that just might be able to grow beyond the deadlock of polarized and stagnant modernity. Hi, Rich.
Hi, Layman. Nice to meet you.
How was that introduction?
That was poetry. That was poetry. Thank you. I don't know who that person is. He sounds really cool, though.
I was actually thinking this morning, your name sounds to me, when I say it, like a dessert. Like I imagine someone saying, after the main course, we'll be serving a lovely Rich Tafel drizzled in caramel.
That's true, actually, because the name can mean table in German and Dutch. And in some places it is a food.
You say Tafel or Tafel?
If it's correct, it would be Tafel, kind of blackboard or a large table in German. But most Americans say Tafel, and I'm pretty happy being called whatever. I just prefer at this point in my life not to be called Dick. And I decided that when I was in third grade for obvious reasons.
I have a friend named Richard from high school who legally changed his name to Dick. So he's going the other way on that.
He's brave. He's much braver than me. It was tough.
Maybe as a way for people to get to know you up front, why don't you sort of give us a sense of why you think authentic conservatism is inherently integrative?
Oh, that's a great question. So that is a very common question, particularly among integral people who are generally mostly all progressive. Look, for me, conservatism just means that you respect the past. So you know, if something got this far, tradition, there's a reason for it. So you respect it. And then in the moment you innovate, you see what needs to be changed. And then you're really dedicated also to the future of people who aren't on the earth yet. And you're trying to create a better world. So that would be sort of Burkean conservatism. And to me, it's very, very integral. It's very stage-oriented, very developmental. It's very step-by-step. Let's take it one step at a time. Let's go through the various stages. Whereas I think a lot of progressivism, as a counter for me, it tends to be more utopian, and we're going to jump to this new level. This grand new world is going to be created. And that makes me nervous.
Okay. I was listening to your interview with my friends Ryan and Nate over at the Metaideological podcast. Mm-hmm. And something you said there really got my attention. It was about how, like, as a gay Republican, you fielded a lot of questions from other conservatives about the homosexual experience, about the AIDS crisis, about things like that. Questions they felt like they couldn't really ask a liberal progressive because of the sense that they would be dismissed in advance as being part of the problem. So how big an issue is it that understanding isn't being shared between people because they're assuming in advance that the other side is irredeemably foolish and regressive and problematic?
That's really what got me into politics. So again, my background is undergraduate philosophy, graduate theology, and mysticism. How did I get into politics? Was that I was also a gay man coming into the closet in the 80s. I was an AIDS buddy helping people essentially die. And I was like, where's the systems change here? And I realized, and I'm a moderate Republican family from Pennsylvania, not an ideologue at all and not really all that political. But I did realize if the gay community and the AIDS crisis were going to be resolved, it would have to become a bipartisan issue. And it was increasingly at that time becoming extremely partisan in the sense that it was almost a radical left at the time. And I just started with a simple premise. What if someone educated Republicans, conservatives, in their own language about these issues? Because I don't think they're partisan. And I think we need to, if we leave this as a partisan issue, more people will die and a lot of people will suffer. If we can make it a non-issue and educate people and make it a win for both political parties, we can remove it from the culture wars, which were then just really getting started, point one, that was the 90s. And that was absolutely true. A quick example, I worked on a campaign for a friend of mine, but I also worked on a governor campaign for a governor from Massachusetts when I was in my 20s. And, it was AIDS 101, Gay 101. This is, of course, 1989, 1990. So the public was very ignorant in general, particularly in the straight public. And we walked him through, and he decided to run as a libertarian Republican in Massachusetts against an opponent who was a Democrat, head of a college, Boston University, who had a gay son and was extremely homophobic, and just made the case that, you could actually win on this strategy. So lo and behold, he does break 40 years of change and wins Bill Weld, and goes on to become the most pro-gay governor in the United States at that time, better than any Democrat. What was interesting, though, is he's like, no one has ever talked to me about these things. Like, no one explained it. And then I started getting calls from mayors and congressmen and senators around the country. What does HIV stand for? What does it mean? I have to pass an AIDS bill. I don't understand the issue. I certainly don't understand the gay issue. Can you just walk me through it? I thought it was a progressive, revolutionary attempt to destroy the family. Can you explain how that's not the case? Explain how you don't, people would just point blank say, explain that you don't want to hit on kids. This was the 90s. So it was very 101, but I realized if you don't deal with those issues in the language of the audience that you're speaking to with some trust, they're not educated, and it just perpetuates it. So that's one of my beliefs, is the reason that the gay and lesbian issue moved so quickly is because it was uniquely bipartisan. It had a strategy of people working with both sides.
Seems like the ability to bring people together and to help politicians see a broader range of options for their own success requires some very specific internal conditions. Obviously, you have to be able to hold on to your own values while being comfortable around people that don't understand you or might even be hostile to you, and also who have this background sense of real limitation on what the possibilities of action are. Do you think people can just do that politically, or do they inherently need a spiritual or therapeutic practice to give them the ability to engage in those sorts of interventions?
I think if most people can't do it themselves, they probably would not engage in a practice, but they need someone at least to give them a way out. So, here's a concrete example. During that time, this is not necessarily political, but I did deal with a lot of parents who were conservative, and their kid would come out. And so they really had two worldview choices at that point. I either love the kid and I come to terms with this issue, or I kick the kid out because it's an abomination to God and I'm Catholic, and this is a no-brainer. My priest said it's an abomination. Or some middle ground where we don't talk to each other, but I don't, and that was a classic example for me of people having to pick a path. And so if I could argue with him at the time, look, you're a conservative, you're a Christian, love is the most important principle here, and loving your child trumps every other principle in your world. You have you can't even call yourself a Christian if you throw this kid out into the street and lead to those consequences. That was using their value systems, which were at war with themselves at some level. And so those parents had to make a choice between two value systems. I don't think they had a spiritual practice so much. I'm amazed how reflexively many Christians just tune out they just say, hey, this is what my pastor said, this is what the Bible says. And that's the end of their thinking. So anybody that can challenge that a little bit and say, actually, you're more complex in your conservatism or your faith. And there's another way. So I think you can show them the other way.
So it's more of a growth phenomenon than it is having a specific spiritual practice. And that growth phenomenon is frequently catalyzed by a conflict within the person's value system.
Yes, I think there's some people, and I think you're one of them, for example, and others are what I would call translators. And that's their gift. They can actually go into different value systems and say, actually, I'm going to find a way for you to do this that fits into your system, that it won't allow you don't have to betray your beliefs. We can be fairly consistent, but the spiritual practice is with the translator. Like the translator has the ability, because the translator has the ability not to come into those situations angry. Or you will be insulted. You're sort of like an ambassador, but you will sort of be Yeah, you got to you put yourself second, and you're trying to deal with this person first. That's the spiritual practice.
Seems like you have a lot of real world experience in trying to make change while maybe operating outside of the normal identity clusters typical in American politics. Mm-hmm. And you're also aware of, well-meaning, smart people who are involved in projects to bring, a transpartisan, evolutionary, new kind of thinking to politics. From the point of view of your experience, what do you think are the main mistakes or misapprehensions that these people who want to make that change bring in with them? Like when it comes to making real change, what in general isn't obvious to the people who want to make that change, or maybe even runs against their feelings of how change should get made?
Well, one, I think people believe that in the transpartisan movement, if I can get two people from different perspectives together to have a conversation, that will lead to change. And it's kind of this sort of logical. I get it. But it's not been my experience. I've actually seen situations where people can leave those situations more like, wow, I really didn't realize how crazy they were. Now I'm really opposed to that viewpoint. So I think that's a mistake that I see. The other is particularly progressives, because I've done a lot of strategy and consulting. So I've had clients and I'll explain a strategy and they'll be like, I'm not working with them. If that's what it takes,
right,
I will not work with them. And I'll say, do you want to win or do you want to be right? Like, is this cause so important that you really want to win? Because I can give you a path to victory. And they essentially say in so many words, I want to be right. Like, I cannot compromise and meet with those people. I cannot compromise and pretend that in any way that anything that they're saying is valuable. A classic example in that space would be the environmental issues, where I'd say maybe we could sit down with oil companies, or in the healthcare, where we could talk to the pharmaceuticals on this issue. And they're like, no, I will not meet with big pharma. I will not meet with big oil. I will not meet with Republicans because they're evil. And, I'm not going to work with Nazis. So that's a very common, world. Those are two of the biggest issues that I find in the space of people who say they're out to change the world for the better. And you scratch the surface and they're really wanting to be right.
So I'm sure you're correct. There's a lot of people who they don't want to deal with something that they think is terrible with the wrong side. Right. But there must also be a number of people who just don't get involved in politics because it feels like it would be degenerative and gross. And right, it's not that one side is right, but that the whole system seems like something they don't want to get in. They would undermine their quality of life and what they want to work on, even though they really are civically minded and really do see the possibilities of a new kind of politics. Is the ethos of American politics not as bad as we think? Does it take a particular type of person to do battle in the Bardo realm of the swamp? For yourself, when you're in those spaces and you're trying to do political judo or something, you're trying to work with the energy that you're confronted by, how do you stay sane and keep your integrity clean and intact in that world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're absolutely right. It's very draining energetically and spiritually, frankly. So most people that I talk to now, and this is a very frightening trend among younger people, are just saying, look, Rich, I've learned to keep my head down. I'm going to keep my mouth shut. I'm going to be very careful what I tweet. I'm going to get very careful what I say on Facebook. I'm going to be very bland. I don't want to destroy my job. I don't want to alienate anybody. And if I'm in school, I don't want to piss off my professor. So I'm learning to sort of lie just to keep safe. And that's definitely a trend. So the idea of being in politics where you have to declare for something is frightening. And in my own life, because I really was not a political person, but ended up becoming quite political, the slings and arrows I took, people would always say, I would never, like, you're a nice guy, but you are demonized as this person. I don't want to get in that sphere. So I think you're right. I think, unfortunately, what happens is maybe 10 to 15% of the population on both ends pollute the environment. They're screamers, and they make everybody else, when you're in that room, you just want to get out of the room. And they know that. So they run the caucuses and they run the primaries, and you don't want to get involved. As far as how do you do it, that's where your earlier question about spiritual practice, I think you have to have an energy source outside of yourself You're not going to get energy from politics, in my opinion. Most of the people I'm working with at the higher levels would be on a narcissistic, and you'd kind of have to be. I don't judge them for that, because you'd almost have to be to, as one of them said, go to Red Lobster and shake hands with people and beg everybody for money for 2 years before I do anything. I wouldn't do it. And so I think that, yeah, you go into those rooms, but it's a little bit soul crushing in many of the situations. So you do have to sort of come in with, why am I here? Also, what's important in that world is so skewed from, I would say, what's important from a good life, that you also have to be clear why you're getting in, because it does, the energies will pull you, and the dollars, what you can make as a lobbyist is quite dramatic. It can pull you in different directions. So I think it is a swamp, and I think I don't deny that, but I often joke and say it's like going into hell for a heavenly cause. Like who are we leaving this to if we abandon it?
Does it seem to you like a war, or does it seem to you more playful than that? Is it more game-like?
It's a good question. At various times, I've been surprised, if you think of if you believe in the various stages of interculture, I've been surprised at times in very dire situations where I've literally dropped to my warrior level and been like, whoa, who is that? Like, where did that come from? Being screamed down at events, or situations where the police tell you your life is threatened if you speak here. This is in the past. So I was surprised how much of a warrior I really was. So that was not playful. The rest of it, you have to have, I have a good sense of humor, and I'm a prankster. So, I'm, sort of, as an avatar, I guess I'm a bit of the fool. I do have fun with it. I don't take it all that seriously. I think some of the things I hear on a daily basis are quite funny. Things that people have said about me to my face are very insulting, to the point where they don't mean to be, but they're actually funny. You share this with your friends later, and these are stories that you'll live for years as funny. So there's a game part to it, and there's fun. You can't take it all too seriously, or the people who take it seriously are very crushed by it.
Something coming up for me around a play and risk taking. You mentioned young people feeling kind of fearful and conformist in keeping their head down and trying not to, send out the wrong tweet that they might get called on later. And it seems like there's something like that within the political system as well. I can't, when was the last time a president had a beard or wore a white suit instead of black or dark gray? If people don't feel daring enough to make even small changes like that, how can we expect them and the system to possibly be willing to make the transformative shifts we need to survive and thrive collectively over the next century? Is there an absence of courage, an absence of risk taking in our society now? Like, over the course of your lifetime, has that changed? Seems like if you look at music and culture, you think, well, maybe the 60s and 70s people were more daring or something, but I don't know. That's all speculative for me.
There definitely is not a playful, or, like you're saying, any kind of creative. It's very much a path, and you're very much on it. And you look at people like me, they would say this to my face: You're interesting, Rich. I admire you. I like the life you're living, but it's not really all that successful. You're not successful in the way I'm going to be successful. You're not powerful the way I'm powerful. So I've made this trade. I think the public is craving what you're describing, somebody who will be a little offbeat and authentic, maybe dress differently and try different things. And I believe that was the energy for Obama. And I think part of the energy, and so it was the outsider. He's different. He's not playing the game. Then he played the game. Then I think people felt that way for Trump. And Trump governed very much like to the surprise of many, like a traditional Republican in many ways. So people were like, okay, he said he was going to be different. They're still waiting. And the danger of that is that many people say, I just want someone who will just shake up the system. But I think like Andrew Yang as a person in the last race was someone who had a good heart, for my sense. I don't know him, but he was coming in and saying, hey, I'm an entrepreneur and this is messed up. And I've got entrepreneurial visions of how this could be better. And he came from a place of sincerity are we ready for that? Are we ready for people who are real? I think we're getting very exhausted and very fearful. And I'm hoping that my theory is that this will break, that when someone comes along who is authentic, that we'll move to that, because we've gone so deep into this area of false, perspectives.
Seems like we've tried everything else. We might as well try sincerity.
Yeah. Let's see if a true, honest person might work. And could they survive in the fundraising system and so forth? And could they survive in the various spaces in it?
Yeah, it would take a very specific temperament to be able to do all those things.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of I think it's in one of Jonathan Haidt's books. He discusses a study about communicating with Americans about ecological issues. And what they found was a lot of self-identified liberals will nod when they hear about environmental problems and agree that we need to implement changes. And a lot of self-identified conservatives found this unpalatable or even troubling. But that changed dramatically when the messaging was changed, where they would say, look, we've got the greatest country in the world, and therefore we've got the greatest nature in the world, and therefore we've got to toughen up and make some sacrifices to preserve our land and our nature. In your experience, do you think people fundamentally have different values, or do they just need to prioritize those values differently, hear them in a different order? Do we sort of all have the same ones in a different sequence, or do we fundamentally have different ones?
That's a great question. So I think that we've long believed in Washington that people were divided along policies. That's just not been my experience. And watching the evolution on the gay issue was a perfect example. That people move very quickly on it, dramatically quickly on gay marriage or gays in the military when there was bipartisan, it was put in their language. What's really proven that to be true is that Donald Trump came in and said, we're going to get out of military engagement around the world. We're going to, increase spending. And these were, sort of heretical anti-Republican positions. And then I watched my Republicans, one, put their finger in the wind, who were establishment, say, this guy could win. This guy could beat the Democrats. Let's go with that. So suddenly all those policy issues went out the window. Now they're bringing them back in a hypocritical way, saying, oh, we've got to balance the budget. So that, I think, reveals that unfortunately right now we're looking at flags. We're looking for someone on our team to wave a flag who we trust. And whatever they say, we'll do. Another quick example is that Trump, this is hard for people to get, was the most pro-gay Republican president and mentioned LGBTQ in his convention speech. And the audience went with it. In a way, those audiences are the toughest on conservative issues, but they went with it. On the flip side, I've worked a lot building coalitions with Democrats, and particularly in the Black community, which is very homophobic and doesn't fit into sort of an intersectional coalition. I watched a lot of Black voters in many cases who, their religion made them anti-gay. They were very evangelical, get on board on our gay issues because that was what it was to be a Democrat. They didn't really believe it. So I think that many of the times when we see people saying they believe in certain issues that are with their party, that's in mile wide and an inch deep. It just means that they've been told that's part of their identity now. And now I'm watching a fascinating thing happen, which is evangelicals that have increased their numbers because of Trump. That Trump is a catalyst for secular people to become evangelical is a fascinating trend, because that, of course, has nothing to do with what it means to be a Christian. So it's pretty fascinating how people identifying with the flag on their side will, and I find that most of us kind of agree on all policies. Like if I could really get a group together, there's very little division on some of the biggest issues, but those are purposely manufactured to create teams and to create contests.
I think borders is the perfect example of that, because when you talk to people, there's no real disagreement. You need strong borders, but they have to be able to permeably let in the people we want to let in for a variety of reasons. Everybody can kind of agree about that. Yeah. But so much of it comes down to either flags or tones. And this intrigues me because I've often thought, would universal health care and UBI and jobs guarantees be more popular in rural areas if the spokesman was Joe Rogan, who agrees with all those policies, but doesn't seem like he has the same mood that we associate with the cosmopolitan progressives. So if it's not really about policies, then the negative version of that is it could just be about flags and team sports. But the positive version about it is that maybe it's just about your tone and your mood. And that's something we could actually work with by bringing a variety of different tones together.
That's right. And I think I agree with all that. And I think that it's an authentic messenger too. Like, in other words, Washington is full of people who craft words on a focus group basis. Yeah. And you can tell the candidate that just ran in Virginia for governor and the team that was working with him, I could just tell those were canned focus group lines that had no resonance. Even as they spoke, it was like blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So yes, did those test well? Yeah. But did they have any authenticity to the moment or to what they were saying? No. So I think it's the combination. And I think a lot of people confuse getting the right language with also the authentic messenger. So I think the combination is very critical. Who says it? Who says it? Like you're saying, on a lot of these issues. And so on all the issues that I work on, I'm always looking to, if it's a social issue, I always start from the right, and I get people on the right who would support it, and I know the left will follow. If it's a more fiscal issue, I would work with people on the left, get them on board, and then I know the right will follow. But I've actually harnessed some of the partisan energy, because you use what you have, like, sort of like the fool, I guess, but you use what you have. And there were situations where I would say to Republicans, if you fund this AIDS bill to this dollar figure, you'll be funding it higher than Bill Clinton. And you can put out a press release chastising the administration on this AIDS policy. And they were like, love it. They didn't particularly care about the issue, but and they did. And then immediately, once they did that, the Democrats rushed out higher spending because they couldn't be beat on it. And so you that's kind of working with the energies. It sounds a little Machiavellian, but you kind of work with what's there.
Seems like there are so many opportunities to do that are untapped. Like, if Trump had come out as a hard environmentalist, I know a lot of people who hate him, who might have been all in on that.
Hard to say, because almost anything that at this point, anything that he was in favor of, if you were anti-Trump, you opposed, and anything that so generally people kind of stuck to their thing. So even if he came out hard on a very positive agenda for the environment, he would have been criticized by the left because it was XYZ, it didn't do that, or and so I've watched that. The example is working with that governor I mentioned years ago, where he did all these great gay things. I mean, it was finally the press had to say he was the most pro-gay in the country, and the community still endorsed in the next round the Democrat running, and didn't acknowledge it till now. They will look back and say, yeah, he was really amazing. But at the time, I remember, I was just like, wow, no matter what he says, because he's a Republican, you can't support him.
So even some of those opportunities for a person to get out ahead of the other side on an issue become subsumed back into the polarization. And do you think that polarization is built into the structure of our system, or is it just endemic to the way humans think?
That's a great question. I think it's happened, it's certainly been a part of American politics. Once it did first pass the post, meaning, win, lose, it created two parties. They didn't exist at the beginning. So it drives that two-party polarization, us against them. And it's so powerful that even the names that remain have literally switched sides of what they believed. The Republicans fighting to end slavery, the Democrats fighting to maintain slavery. So they keep using these names, and they keep sort of shifting back. So the polarization there is definitely there. I think what's new is that at this point, we have so much information, it's overwhelming. And we all feel, if you ask people, I have so little time. So that combination of feeling scarcity about time and knowing there's so much information means that I need to defer to somebody. I'm going to pick somebody. It could be my uncle, could be my dad, could be my partner, but it could be the CNN anchors, or it could be Joe Rogan. I'm looking for the most honest person that I kind of sort of agree with. And then I kind of, outsource my decision making to that person to tell me what to make of it. Because people tell me all the time, I am so angry about this Build Back Better bill. And can you tell me anything that's in the bill? Like, have you ever read anything on it? Do you have any idea other than maybe what you heard on NPR? And, no, nobody's ever read it. Nobody's ever studied it. It's too complicated, frankly, and it's purposefully that way. So I think that is added to polarization in that, as we were saying, if a certain candidate came out for a certain issue, Afghanistan is a perfect example. The Republicans did something they rarely did under Trump and said, we're going to get out. We're going to get out fast. We're going to meet with the Taliban at Camp David. That's all Republican heresy. I mean, it really was radical. It's been the position of the Democrats. So when Joe Biden gets out of Afghanistan, as he said he would, all my Trump friends criticize him. How dare we get out of Afghanistan, forgetting that they had voted for someone who promised to do it months earlier and criticized the length of time. So that just shows it's incoherent, but it's just an opportunity for polarization. To my side, didn't do it. And I saw Democrats defending it, Biden, and I was like, you're going to defend the way that we got out of there, but it was just because it was my team. So that, to your point, that's where I'm just now trusting whatever my side is, because the other side is so evil that I need to go with the incompetence even of my team. And many Trump supporters will say, yes, he's a terrible person. He's crude and disgusting, but he is a bulwark against. And many people who voted for Biden, particularly my more progressive wing Democrats, were like, can't stand him, the worst choice. But if he's a bulwark against evil, I will give everything to Joe Biden. So that's also how decisions are being made.
I wonder how much of that is modernist, in the sense that it's part of a gameplay where the policies don't matter because they're just tools in a competition and you have to be strategic. And if it's fine to switch positions because you're just playing a game trying to defeat the enemy. And how much of that is pre-modern in the sense of the kind of loyalty spirit of the folk, right? That someone's mother is always going to say nice things about their kid, even if it involves completely contradicting what you said a second ago, because loyalty is the value and not consistency of speech. Is this an ancient thing or is this a modern thing? Is it gameplay or is it loyalty?
I think it's pre-modern in the sense of loyalty, but what modern made so complicated was making everything so complicated that I have so much information. There's so many voices that I'm going to kind of declare for a side and just go with it. And once where you really see that play out, that almost pre-modern loyalty factor, is once somebody like a Joe Rogan, who is said he supported for Bernie Sanders, questioned some of the vaccine stuff, being ostracized by the left to the point where they said, we don't want his endorsement for Bernie. You have heretics, anybody who is heterodox and slightly complicated, which all this is, and none of us really, truly, I've never met a person who aligns to a political party in the moment. We're all complex. And as you were saying, people can look at any issue and sort of see the complexity of a crime or the environment. They can kind of see it. It's a bit of this and a bit of that. And this is kind of where I come down. So we are all complex. We all hold those viewpoints. But where you really see the threat to the loyalty is when someone's heterodox and says, like for me, when I would say I'm gay and a Republican and conservative, oh, and by the way, I'm also a minister. That freaks people out because you need to be on our team in our box. And here are the boxes, and here's where you fit in. When I first was coming out, people said, you need to not come out and marry a woman if you want to have a minister path in your life, which was kind of true at that time. So lie, again, go against your most basic Christian principle and lie to do it. Then when I came out as gay, everybody's like, you do know, like, we are all Democrats. You do understand that this is just who we are. This is what enlightenment is. Get with it. When you don't do it, the anger of people. And the funny part is the gays who would criticize me, and very often when I know them, are more conservative on many issues than I am. I'm a wishy-washy mix of things on a lot of issues. And I'm sort of like a Northeastern Republican. I'm complex. But I would talk to them and they'd be like, particularly progressives, they'd be like, we need to stop the border. Like, shoot them. Like, that's what people are going to have to do this. And I'd be like, whoa, where did that come from? And they'll say, you'll never hear me say that publicly, because we will punish heretics, anybody who's off the reservation in any way. And what I find increasingly happening is something we spoke about earlier. Some people have seen the success of screaming down each other and threatening and almost mafia tactics that lead to cancel culture. That intimidates people, and they learn not to say, I see people who are waving the flag for their party or their cause. And if I meet with them privately, they'll tell me honestly what they feel. And they have more complex feelings about their party than I even do. But I defend their party sometimes to them on both sides. I say, well, no, so that's the complexity of what we're in. There's sort of a pre-modern loyalty, but modernity got so confusing to make meaning out of what I'm experiencing that we've reverted back to almost a tribal mentality.
Yeah, I think there are a number of structural factors in modernity that regenerate tribalism.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of different ways to think about what left and right mean. And one way that people sometimes use has to do with the tempo of change. So that there are some people in a population that hear abstractly about a problem and sympathize and quickly decide we need to implement changes, and other people who don't take it seriously until it affects them or until it's been sort of vetted by a couple of generations. Mm-hmm. And that's smart, right? We're a more robust species if we have both a gas pedal and a brake. Mm-hmm. But can we afford to keep doing it that way when the rate of technological and ecological change is happening so quickly? So that if we apply our instincts for natural hesitancy and skepticism toward large-scale social adaptations, we could very well get overtaken by the radical pace of events. Right? Are you at all concerned that the conservative tempo and even the conservatism of the liberal moderates might be out of step with the emerging historical moment?
Well, I know that's a very common way to look at progressives and conservatives. Progressives have their foot on the gas, conservatives have their foot on the brake. That's never been my experience, to be honest. I work in social impact investing, and I work with businesses. I work with churches in the spiritual field, and I've coached hundreds of entrepreneurs, many who are conservative. They are coming up with the most innovative ideas. I see myself as a conservative as a very much of an innovator. I'm always saying, what can we do to improve it? But I want realistic solutions. And if you can't tell me a path to get to it, don't waste my time. That's what a conservative is. Progressives, on the other hand, I find in my life, interestingly enough, this goes against the grain, have been very much the status quo state group. They have fought on many issues. I mean, people are very surprised to hear that on gay marriage, for example, it was many of the gay and lesbian progressive groups that fought it. On gays in the military, they fought that. When we did AIDS funding, they fought working with Big Pharma to find a solution for the AIDS drugs. And I've just seen that consistently through my life, where progressives are like, we've got to make sure every child is educated, but they reinforce unions and school systems that are so broken in urban areas that they themselves then send their kids to private schools. So they're opting out of systems change. So in my experience, I think conservatism, and that's why I think a lot of business people are conservative, because you're always pivoting, you're always changing, but you are always very realistic. Another way of looking at it I've seen in my life is that conservatives tend to look at the interior of a person's life as a huge factor of an issue. And whereas progressives tend to look at taking away the shackles of what society has put on people. So people are fundamentally good. They're oppressed by the system. If you remove the oppression, people thrive. That would be my experience with progressives. Conservatives are like, we're a mixed game, and we have a lot of responsibility and freedom in our life, and we need to be held accountable and maybe even punished sometimes if we break the law. But we need to be held accountable in our own lives, and not be a victim. We have to take seriously our agency. That's generally been my experience of the divide, because when I talk about a topic like crime, for example, there's no, I would argue there is definitely a case for systemic racism. I think it's impossible not to. And I'm talking about even redlining and just under I think racism is a huge deal, and it permeates so much of people's mentality. And I think it has 2.0 and 3.0 different. It's not about slavery, but it's a very complex racism. So that's true. But also saying to young people who commit crimes, it's not your fault because you were raised in this environment and society's against you. Bad message. No, you are responsible for what you do, and everything is not your fault. You didn't have the best home life. You were in poverty. What can we do about that? But you're responsible for your behavior. That would be more likely what I experience. And when I say those things, progressives generally say, "Oh, he's a racist," because you're blaming the victim. So those are the divides. But I don't see the divide in my life. If the conservatives would take on climate change as an issue, which I work with some who are trying, that'll move the needle. The progressives will talk about this endlessly and platform on it endlessly and talk about it, but I don't get the sense that they're as interested. The groups like the Breakthrough Institute, which are center left, Michael Schellenberger and Alex and so forth, I always admired that group because they were center left, mainly Democrats funded by progressives, but they were looking at nuclear as a possible solution. That's where solutions are going to come at that from that mix, not so much just articulating, having a Greta Thunberg scold people.
That's it's fascinating because I think there's this normal sense that our perspectives are embedded on one of the two sides. And then there's a meta-ideological discussion, which is there's a lot of different perspectives on how those two sides can be interpreted and what they mean. Right. Mm-hmm. So there's one is that tempo thing I mentioned. Another one is what you're saying is we have to vet the changes according to what's anchored in our sense of reality and what's worked in the past. Mm-hmm. Another one I think that comes up a lot is the sense that conservatives have maybe a better instinct for complexity, right? For the sense that there's huge systems that we can't predict and we have to have strategies for dealing with what we don't understand. And very often liberals have attempted to apply top-down solutions as if they understood everything. The famous Burke and Paine arguments around the French Revolution kind of characterize that. Another one is around the issue of whether we appreciate difference or not in a certain way. I'm thinking of there's a series of books called the Lord John series, and it's about a gay British aristocrat during the Napoleonic era, and homosexuality is sort of a hanging offense at the time. But he's not bothered by that individually, right? He thinks society is risk and not everything should be the same for everyone. And when I first read it, I thought, this is very strange. This is not at all like the values I grew up with, where, basically everybody should be in the same boat and it doesn't even matter what anybody's preferences are. But there's this old-fashioned sensibility, or maybe a conservative sensibility, that it's okay for people to be different and to be in different categories. Like, should there be different bathrooms for different races, right? Or should there be well-defined roles for men and women? Or should immigrants and criminals not get the same treatment as naturalized householders? These kind of issues over history have very often been flashpoints between the left and the right, where the left has wanted to treat everyone homogenously, and the right has said, no, there's a strong role for people to be separated into different groupings. How do you feel about that way of phrasing the difference? And, do you think difference itself is one of the hardest things for the left to appreciate?
Some good questions. Let me make sure I answer them all. I think that on the complexity issue, first, I would agree with you. And I believe that the secret sauce, when I'm coaching people on the kind of stuff, is I basically say, tell me about yourself. And they generally tell me in the very traditional silos and roles that are obvious. And I say, go deeper. Like, tell me about your complexity. Tell me your complex views. And I think that, I call them translators. They have the ability to go into their life, into their background and say, I have a part of me that is traditional. got a part of me that's warrior. I've got a part of me that's modern. I've got a part of me that might be postmodern or integral. Like I've got these different voices or parts of myself, and they're authentic, and I can pull them out. I can pull out that complexity within myself and realize that whoever I'm talking to, they're complex.
Yeah.
And I bet we find somewhere in our complexity that we could actually start a conversation, though the topic that everybody wants us to debate about may be very controversial. We'll never agree, but there's a common ground. So I do believe that I do see complexity and nuance as very important. And I obviously spent my life refusing to fit into labels, but very decidedly. One thing is it smokes people out right away. As soon as a progressive, who even that name progressive is quite an arrogant name, like we're ahead of you, we're the progress, we're leading the edge. As soon as they shut me down instantly without knowing anything about me because of my work on the conservative things, they've told me everything. Like it probably is not going to be a very profitable engagement anyway, but I mean, it's just, wow. And I've gotten that much more on the left than I have working in conservative circles. So that, I think that I really like that point about the complexity within each of us. Now you asked, you were also going in another place. Can you just remind me the second part of that?
Yeah, it's the question about whether we can tolerate differences in society and in culture, right? Whether, treating people homogeneously or treating people as groups where it's okay to feel that we're quite distinct from each other and maybe have different situations and different needs and different roles.
Yeah, I think that's cool. I think that is definitely more of a conservative perspective. The challenge for conservatives traditionally in the past was that, going back to even traditional cultures, you were locked into your viewpoint, and that permeated into modernity. But it was sort of like, we're going to keep certain people out of college, Black people, Jews, gays. We're going to make sure that, so we're going to keep you in a caste system. So there is sort of and you can say, yeah, we're all very different, but if it locks people in, if it's not the truly conservative, from my perspective, position is everybody should have an opportunity. Doesn't mean we'll have equality at the end of the day, but everybody should, as much as possible, be given equal opportunity. The left generally says we should have equality of results, which I think is a fiction. I think it's impossible, and it's dangerous if you try to enforce it. So yeah, I think that we have the downside of that idea of differences is if you, like, going back, do you lock people into their differences? And I would say you celebrate differences, absolutely. Be heterodox, be complex, show your complexity, and allow people to change and evolve. That's the other key. And a lot of the change strategies I work with, when the person who was long opposed to the issue that we're working on changes, I see a bitterness among the activists. I'm like, because they almost enjoyed them stuck at that level. And I'm like, this is what we should be celebrating. At a personal level, gay people would say, I'm never going to speak to my parents again because they don't understand, don't accept that I'm gay. And I said, well, how long did it take you to figure out that you were gay? And years. Okay, give them a break. Sometimes it's not a healthy thing you just have to cut your ties. But give people a break. Let them evolve. Give them a space. Give them a safe space to evolve instead of locking them into what you see as their diverse roles. And people are constantly open to changing and moving.
That difference between a locked-in caste structure of differences and an evolutionary open version of differences speaks to a major problem that's always being addressed in sort of integral politics, which is the conflation of levels with left-right polarization. If there's something like conservative and liberal at every stage, even though it's going to look different at every stage and be much harder to tell the differences apart as we go up the holarchy. But nonetheless, if it's there at every stage, then we have to be able to tease apart what conservative means from what traditional culture is. Exactly. Traditional culture gives us a version sometimes of conservatism, but I think both sides, and certainly all the pundits and most of the academics, seem to conflate those things and then sort of orbit around the same blind spots in their political discourse.
Completely agree. I think most integral thinkers that I've heard speak sort of like Republicans are traditional, Democrats are postmodern, and there's a mix in the middle or something like that. Well, that's just not been my experience. Traditional, a very good example is the Black church. If you know anything about it, they have much more in common with white evangelicals and how they feel about gay rights or the role of women. And I remember when Hillary was running, they interviewed a group of conservative Black women who said, I couldn't vote for a woman shouldn't be president. And they quickly ended the interview. There's no curiosity or interest in that because it doesn't fit with the narrative, which is that the Black community is a homogenous group that is all in the cutting edge of the progressive vanguard. Not true. So that's a good example of a left-right dialectic at traditional, though of course now, and we all know that most of those traditional people were 50 years ago Democrats. So they've also switched parties. Even the South was a solidly Democrat region. So there's a lot of movement and change going on, even in that traditional level. And certainly at modern, I think people are very clear on it. Where I've gotten most pushback is I've argued there's a postmodern right. People don't like that. And it just depends on how you define postmodern. And that's a complex definition. But if it's pushing off of modern and questioning the failures of modern, there's a lot of people who are conservative and they're not looking to go back to traditional. They're not particularly religious. They're not going back to the 10 Commandments, but there is a group, often very secular, on the right who's questioning the failures of the banks, the failures of American foreign policy, the failures that they were left behind. It generally does track more racially toward white, toward white men. But there is that, and then that can be very unhealthy. The same way that we can have a mean green left, but we can have but it can be a positive critique too, and that's how you can't say anything positive about Trump. Trump was questioning on foreign policy America's role in the world in a way that needed to be questioned because we're operating under a system that is after World War II, and he's questioning orthodoxies, kind of which I hold. I'm sort of a America around the world freedom Republican. But I think he was raising very good questions from a working class perspective of why are we building Afghanistan? We're not building Detroit. Good questions. And he by being that outsider, someone I do not support, he shook it up. And Biden kind of ran with it, and it's changing our foreign policy. And it will have dramatic results around the world. So those are examples, I think, where there's a left and right on both sides, but it's not. I always hear that Republicans are traditional, Democrats are postmodern. I think it's absolutely much more complex, and I would be so bold to say that I think the move through integral will probably come on the right. And the reason I say that, and it could be self-serving, because I'm on that side, is that when I go to integral events, it's very postmodern generally. It's very green. And when they tell me that I'm the only Republican they know, I'm like, wow, and they're doing their best in their most kindly, progressive way of saying, like, I want to get to know you. Can we sit down? Can I look in your eyes? And I'm like, dude, if this is where you are, that I'm the only one you know, that's a problem. If you're saying you're second tier, you're probably, pretty deep in postmodern, and all of us have all different levels within us, which is the beauty of the complexity of integral, I think, which is that we all have it and we can tap into it at various levels. But so that's kind of how I would see it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. When people get to thinking in terms of developmental stages, it's way too easy to see everything through that lens. I usually need at least what I call a 3D, right? I need to be thinking of the levels and the polarizations, but also what's healthy and unhealthy for all of those things. And I would think that's the minimum we should be approaching it with. But
yes, I'll just quickly add that if you are more evolved, okay, my experience of that is that you're more humble, like you're kinder, you're more loving. That would be my experience because I come from a spiritual background, but I see it the same way, that people who would be more evolved spiritually would not be looking down at people on and pulling their hair out because people have different worldviews. And this, like, I need to sit down and talk to you because I just don't know anybody. it would just, I think that the more you go, if you want to go up those levels or you grow spiritually, you grow more humble, because it's by the grace of, you look at yourself and by the grace of God go I. I mean, I am much more aware of my failures instead of being someone who now is, I'm at the top of the heap here. So that's one of the paradoxes of it. The further you go up, you should be, I think, kinder, more humble, more loving, and more compassionate, not in any way condescending to people. And that I think even that, when I've been at events where we presented integral to conservative audiences, they immediately look at the chart and go, okay, because it was progressives who were presenting. You're saying I'm here and you're here. Okay, I gotcha. This is just another progressive thing that you're better than me. And they completely dismissed it out of hand.
I think a lot of it comes down to like what developmental progress really means and how that's measured differently than just being able to nominally recognize and verbally articulate sophisticated patterns. And this difference between where you're actually at and the type of content you can speak, it sort of haunts the whole thing. Even what you were saying about the postmodern right or postmodernism in general is tricky, because where are we dealing with real postmodernism and where are we dealing with pre-modern instincts just using those terms now to express itself in its old style?
Exactly. Yeah.
And possibly like you, I get a lot of questions around if I talk about polarization at all of the levels. People want to know, they're curious, well, what would a conservative progressive or a conservative metamodernist actually look like? What's a more advanced version of that? And I usually point to Burke or Nietzsche or Nassim Taleb's writings. For you, what are your, who are your intellectual or political signposts for what a higher conservatism or a deeper conservatism might look like?
Well, it's a good question, because I would have to look back to history, like to a Burke, who I find incredibly integral. Also, being a pastor, so Christianity, Jesus is a huge focus for me. So it's not a political leader, but that would be my ongoing guide through the whole process. Yeah. So I'm watching the complexity of like the Joe Rogans, and I thought maybe Peterson might be somebody who would be, he's certainly bringing in some really conservative messages at a different level. A lot of my friends who I admire the most, people I've worked closely with for years, like Andrew Sullivan, people like David Brooks, who are writers, Jonathan Rauch, David French. What's interesting is a lot of us, and that's kind of maybe my tribe, we also tend to define ourselves in opposition to postmodern left, and almost incredibly, it's an incredible amount of, if I get together with them, we have spent our whole lives fighting that postmodern, green mean, whatever you want to call it, radical left. And I do see it as a threat, the same way I saw Donald Trump as a threat. And it was just sort of two huge threats. And which one was worse? In my mind, this last cycle, it was, choose your poison, but I felt like Trump was worse. So it kind of tipped that scale. But in our elections we've just had this last week in Virginia, voters are also very afraid of a lot of what's going on the left. And of course, the critique now is that it was a racist election that elected an African-American female lieutenant governor from the Republican side. So yeah, that's I don't have that many role models in the conservative movement, but I think that when if those of us that I know on this side, so at the American Project, I host dinners in Washington with young conservatives across the board. We did pre-COVID, in their 20s and 30s. And it's, for an old man like me, it's a good eye into a new world. Like for one thing, they're like, oh, you're the log cabin guy, which I haven't been involved with for years. And they kind of just punch me in the arm like, that's so cool. Not a person has said like, but I still have issues with gay people. So they're at a different level. That's all incorporated. And how they're defining themselves as conservative is really fascinating. And I'm hoping that getting beyond the culture wars and Trump throws an interesting wrench into it for the right now. But what evolves out of this mishmash that we're in right now, I think we're in a period of chaos. But I would say from a spiritual perspective, to move to a new level of order, you have to have chaos. And I feel like that is necessary in this moment, that things won't be clear, and there won't be this person we can point to, but things are about to emerge, I think, that are very exciting and for the better. I think we're moving to a better place. I know that's maybe my most controversial view among my friends, that I'm very positive about the future, despite looking very realistically at what's happening right now.
Yeah, it does seem strange to hear someone being optimistic. I'm thinking of like a cluster of issues like patriotism and immigration and child rearing and community faith and the nation spirit, and very classic kind of conservative issues. And I'm thinking of them revolving around the role of citizenship and what it takes to embody that with integrity. So there's a sense in which being a citizen is a kind of sacred role. And I'm curious what you think the essence of being a citizen is. Like, what are the rights and responsibilities and potentials that make being a citizen different than just being a person?
Yes. Well, let me speak about citizenship. And briefly go back to the last question, very briefly. One point I do make to progressives is my life, I've done every progressive issue. Right now, I'm working on climate change. I've done healthcare. I've done gay rights. I've done AIDS, international development. As a conservative, I find few progressives have done any of that stuff. They've talked about it. So that's where to talk about a progressive conservative. Like, literally, I've done it, but I'm a conservative. So if you can't hold those two things in your head, I've actually done what you're worried about, and I'm conservative there. The question about citizenship is really interesting. I agree with everything you were describing, some very conservative views of citizenship. I am concerned that the left, if the critique of the United States is that it just sucks, and I'm speaking, in the United States, we just suck. We're just a terrible country. We're systemic racism. It's just the big business is killing you. The government's corrupt. You keep doing that, and you have nihilism. And that is the antithesis of citizenship, because it basically says, don't show up, don't get involved. What I learned in my experience getting involved and not having a political background was how much a few people can get done as a citizen. I was stunned what we could accomplish working in the Republican Party in the 90s on gay rights. It was stunning what could be done. And on every strategy that I've worked on, I've usually worked with maybe 8 to 10 people on the Hill, always from both parties. So a small group of people, if you understand the system and you understand how it works as a citizen, you can accomplish things. Right now, it's getting even more complicated because now they're literally not interested purposefully in accomplishing things on both sides, if it gives the other party any success. So that's another level of complexity. There's a group called Citizens University, and it's created by Eric Liu out of Seattle. And and he runs this conference where he brings together all the civic society groups, and they all seek how they can support each other. And of course, they always had a problem getting conservatives to the conference, who, when they came, were generally insulted. But he has really tried, one, to create what I would say is the most healthy postmodern. It's very postmodern. It's very young and diverse and racially diverse and sexual orientation diverse. But he's bringing back a traditional value of civic society to the group and saying, this can be our civil society. And I'm so impressed. I've actually, I serve on the board of that. And I'm just so impressed with what he is doing and what that organization has done. They have civic Saturdays. They have conferences where people stand up and say, this is what I need as a civil group. Can anybody? And funders are in the room and say, we can fund that. Or it's just a really beautiful example of citizenship redefined for a generation that is really quite different from the citizenship in the United States that we knew from the 50s. And that's the last time we talked about it, really. And it has, so he's really incorporating the various levels to a younger generation. And so that's my idea, that's something I can get behind and I'm very excited by, because again, as a conservative, it's not so important that you agree with my idea of citizenship. It's important that you believe in citizenship and you get on your terms and you can get involved and you can accomplish it. I think that's that would be that's a very good integration of various perspectives to accomplish something good. If we keep telling people that they have no power, it's really self-fulfilling, and it does go back to that small group of shouters who are or narcissists who will not leave the room. You're giving them the controls, and that is the most dangerous situation.
I think it's essential for the lifeblood of a nation for people to feel like stepping up to citizenship is an empowering thing, and that it's empowering on the terms of the values that you already hold, that it isn't something in opposition to that. But the question of what goes beyond the nation is intriguing as well. I don't know if you know John Bunzel, who founded the Simple movement.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know him, but I've read his stuff.
When I was talking with him, we were discussing how, his sense is the major forces and problems facing people today are operating outside of and between national boundaries. Mm-hmm. And so he's trying to bring forth simultaneous policy initiatives to grapple with problems at that scale that can't be solved in one country, especially when corporations are playing countries against each other. Mm-hmm. And for him, that works in tandem with a growth from a kind of nation-centric consciousness to a kind of world-centric consciousness. Mm-hmm. I'm curious what you think are the limits of national politics, and whether over the course of your life you've felt anything like an expansion from the national to the world-centric, or whether that's not really the right way to think about it.
Yeah, I do believe there's a paradox. I'm a strong fan of nationalism, defined by me by believing in your country and fighting for your country and protecting your country and improving your country. So I know that's not a popular position. At the same time, the world, as I was saying, through modernity, we grew into a higher levels of complexity. And the complexity of the problems facing the world right now are absolutely not national, in the same way they're not necessarily local. So when I'm given a choice on a policy issue, the first thing as a conservative I always want to do is start locally. I would like as much outside of Washington as possible and start as local as possible, do it in the neighborhoods. And one of the mistakes I think that the left has done is put so much power into Washington that it's become a platform and performative. So on that spectrum, I would like to solve as much as possible on the left. I mean, at the local level. I watched the left get excited about that during the Trump years, which was kind of fun. Like, oh, we could do this local. We could scare that. We could say we don't believe in the federal. I'm like, okay, good. You're coming to the same position. But so let's go now internationally. Internationally, if you want to take an issue, sort of climate change, nuclear weapons, which I still feel is a big but ignored issue, maybe as dangerous as climate change, but international global systems of policing the world. The United States is going to remove itself from a lot of those police positions that held after World War II, and we're going to go into a period of chaos. So what is the global response, say, to an Afghanistan or to climate change, nuclear weapons, or as we just saw, the pandemic? None of those really can be completely successfully resolved. It's sort of like the example of peeing in your pool. You pee in the pool, everybody's affected by it. So we're experiencing that globally. So there has to be global solutions. This is where my conservatism comes in. I would say the idea that international groups are going to solve it, that we send money to and they do it, has just not been my experience. I mean, I've worked with the United Nations on various projects, and it's not a positive experience. It's a bureaucracy within a bureaucracy within people whose salaries are quite high to do things, to pontificate, to write papers. It is not. I dread it when they tell me you're going to have to get the UN on this. I'm just like, oh God, please. So those bodies have become they're quite like modern bureaucratic, unsuccessful systems generally. And the idea of a global government is a very frightening thing for just pretty much everybody except utopians, maybe on the left, I don't know, but that's not going to work. What I do think is better networks and collaboration across international issues and recognizing it and figuring that out. And that's just taking strategy to a higher level. I've been doing strategy my whole life. It's never been win-win. It's been always multiple wins. So you do have to find a win for every player in the game at that level, and to solve those issues and figure out what they need, and be suspicious. A lot of what's going on in climate change right now is countries saying we need the money to do it. I'm sorry, as a conservative, I'm very suspicious where that money will be spent, if it really will go to what you're saying. And that's your only argument is money. That's a red flag for me. I want to see other things to resolve complex issues. So yeah, there does need to be decision making, but it's going to be more like there's going to be leaders, and there's going to be more passive players, and it just don't have the bandwidth to get involved. And the leaders are going to have to find ways to collaborate, strategically together to solve the issues. So there's no doubt there's going to have to be an international focus. Everything affects everybody. And we saw it with the pandemic, we're seeing it with immigration, we're seeing it with climate change. So it's no longer the idea that we can just put up a barricade and protect ourselves against the world. The United States is kind of unique with Canada in that we have water on both sides, and that's been a historic buffer against a lot of stuff. But that's not true anymore. We're in a global economy, a global world, and I think that being more sophisticated, one of the things where integral could play a role in this, I've always felt, was if we understood various levels of development without condescension or colonialism, but looked at it and said, the Taliban is operating very naturally at a belief system. And one of the things that I would admire about the Taliban, which sounds like a strange sentence, is that they share a belief in God. I have a belief in God. They've retained that. Modernity crushed God. So I can relate to their being moved by Islam and a certain type of Islam, and have been for generations. What can we do to move the Taliban in a way that it does not give them the choice of reject Islam, become sophisticated, get rid of this garb and get rid of these behaviors? How do we bring you along? How do we accomplish what you want to accomplish at this next level? And it's not giving the warrior level or traditional level guns. So, but understanding that, and in the United States, we do not understand that. We actually think we can go in with a modern mindset, and if we give you schools and certain rules, we can institute modernity. That's consistently a failure. So I think there's ways of being helpful. And in my own life, maybe the biggest project I worked on was a plan to get AIDS drugs to Africa. And that was a very hard sell. And the United States eventually did take the lead on it and made it happen. And I'm very proud of our country. It was the largest spending program since the Marshall Plan, but more than that, it had a great impact. So I've been very involved with that. And in the past, our State Department of the United States has hired me to do programs for countries around the world. So I spent a lot of time working on healthcare in Mexico, for example, and started a company there. And so I'm very much a globalist in that sense, that I would love to help anybody, anywhere. I'm very suspicious, based on my experience, of particularly Americans coming in with their solution, getting paid phenomenal amounts of money on a monthly basis to help people that they then create solutions that are not sustainable because they've never respected the country that they're in. And the best solutions, again, and where I started, are local. So when I would go into a community, I'd say, what do you need? What can we do to kind of get out of your way? What would be the thing? And that's an international solution. But the truth is, it's based on conservative principles of localism and accountability for misuse of funds, which is a big issue. So that's kind of how I look at international work. I think it's, and again, spiritually, I think we're all connected. We're all, in the image of God. We have an obligation. If we happen to be blessed with certain benefits by being born in a certain place, we have a sacred obligation to help other people who are in need. And so that's kind of what would be the driving force for me.
Seems like an integrative mindset or more complex thinkers would have a real role in establishing multiple win scenarios. Not just because we understand people in more dimensions, but because you have to be, it seems to me, you'd have to be aware of the diversity of types of wins that there could be, because those wins are coming from different dimensions of people. And if you think there's only one kind of win, then how are you going to figure out how to give that win to everyone? You can't. You can only get a win scenario if you're where there's all kinds of different wins for different kinds of people. Does that sound true?
That's absolutely true. And the other thing is, if you go into those situations with a solution that you think is brilliant because your think tank came up with it, or your university came up with it, and it makes sense, and it's been discussed at all the panels, and everybody's agreed it's a brilliant solution. If you have no knowledge of the systems at the local level, what will happen is you will not have sustainable change. So yeah, you have the win for the local person, the true win for the local person is going to trump all the other wins that you might have. How do they? Any solution where you pull out and the thing fails is a failure. And I've seen that in many situations. As I've done focus groups in the beginning, I've done focus groups at the end. And I say, what is your biggest fear about my leaving now? And they say, nobody will respect us. No one will listen to us. They listen to you because you're a white guy from Washington, and no one's going to listen to us. So now what? So those are concrete. It's not sustainable. It was only sustainable because you were involved working those things. So you have to figure out, okay, how can these solutions be sustainable after the entity that played a catalyst role departs?
I'm thinking about the word nation state, which I find fascinating because it kind of links two concepts together, right? There's the sense of being a people, of sharing an ethos, often, but not always, because you inherit the same kind of racial background and history. And then there's the sense of the state as a bureaucratic entity that, a military economic machine of some kind. And it seems like you have a problem if those aren't roughly in balance with each other. And we're looking around the world and we're seeing situations where the boundaries of countries don't seem to match up very closely to people's feelings of who they are. Right? The United States seems to be caught in an ongoing war between maybe two nations fighting for the state. Here in Canada, we're always wondering whether Quebec should be its own country or not. Mm-hmm. Should Scotland go its own way? Should the Basques remain in Spain or do their own thing? And there's no good solution to that in a way, because to make the state fit the nations requires breaking the state down, which is hard to do. And a lot of people just don't want to go that way. But to cultivate a nation that fits the state is equally hard and takes a long time and historically involved lots of violence. So, what's your sense of that uneasy relationship between the, what Integral calls the lower right and the lower left, the sense of the shared identity and the bureaucratic systemic entity?
Yes. Well, it's a very unfortunate situation, particularly because after World War I, map makers in England and so forth just decided to create maps, and they started dividing literally up tribes and cultures, and just for various reasons created countries that had no historic, as you were saying, they might be a state, but the nation poured over those boundaries. And I think we're kind of stuck with it, unfortunately. I think we had a second round of that after the fall of the Soviet Union. And some of those countries, kind of reemerged, but so many of them actually just reemerged as Soviet satellites. They repeated it. But in an evolutionary perspective, maybe they need to. Maybe they need to go through a longer strongman period or something to get to the level. But yeah, I think we're going to have to live with that reality that it's an unmatched nation state. And the US Canada is kind of fascinating to me because from a patronizing perspective, I think the United States, Canadians hate this, but kind of view Canada as part of the United States in a weird way. Like, we're very kindred, and Canadians I know are more knowledgeable about American politics when I talk to them. And I think there's many things the United States can learn from Canada's success, I think, around immigration, I think racism and things like that. I think Canada is actually an interesting example for the United States to look at what it could do. So yeah, I do think that is a mismatch. What's going to be this is going to get more intense as the United States has, everybody complained about our militarism. Well, we're going to reduce our militarism around the world. This is going to create new local conflicts, and it's going to call on countries that didn't have a responsibility to defend themselves and spend money on the military, which is, it is a suck off of other things that those countries, particularly in Europe, didn't have to worry about as much because of NATO and the United States. I think is that shift, we're going to see other shifts in, like you were saying, the nation, the state, and the fact that birth rates in many of these countries are flat and immigration is dramatically increasing. So the world is constantly in flux, but you're right, those nations, many of the places, the nations and the states, they were just literally created by map makers without any sense of what people lived where.
Let's talk a little bit about procedures of collective intelligence. The philosopher Rousseau, and this always sticks in my mind, said that if the election doesn't go your way, you simply bet incorrectly about the will of the people. Right? And that's a neat concept, but obviously you can win an election without a strong majority. And at least today, people don't usually walk out of an election if their side didn't win thinking, well, the collective is smarter than me and made the right decision in ways that I don't understand. And I know there's a lot of talk in the United States about ranked choice voting. Up here in Canada, we've done a lot of studies, and they all say we should have proportional representation in the legislature, but we've never implemented it. Do you think it's possible to get a better kind of outcome to elections and outcome to collective decision-making if we continue to use the same methods for assessing people's feelings and making a collective decision? Like, if we don't change our voting systems, can we get better results than the results we've been getting?
I think probably not. I think the way the voting system accidentally evolved into a system is not something that's, the forefathers put this in the Constitution. This is key to our country, for example. It's just, it evolved into the system. And then the forces that are interested in power have mastered those various systems and are heavily invested in it. One of the hardest things for people to understand is, you think Republicans and Democrats in the United States hate each other. Well, there are certain things they agree on. And gerrymandering, where you redraw districts, for example, is something they sort of agree on, believe it or not, because they've given themselves both districts that they don't have to worry about anybody running against them. So we have it is a broken system right now, in the sense that when I ask people, when you vote, when was the last time you voted for somebody you were excited about and not opposed to? That's a sad situation. Everybody tells me I voted against X. That's not a good system. So there's no doubt that these other reforms are would improve the principle of democracy, which is representation. You want to give as much representation as possible. So percentages or ranked choice voting, these are obvious solutions. They're being test driven in certain states like Maine, in our country, and in localities. So we're gradually seeing a break. California has done a open primary system, for example, and it's working itself out. But clearly, the other model is not great. The problem for me is that you're going to have to work within this system to create the new system. If you bail on this system right now, which people are doing, you're again incentivizing the powers that be that really do like it. It is a very simple system, in the worst sense of the word, to maintain control of certain people. And so if you want to really open it up and give people a new feeling, again, I'm kind of, my experience through change, and my whole life I've been involved with change issues that everybody told me that will never change. And so every one of those things that I was told is not true. Everything changed dramatically for the better. And the issues that I was focused on, I think we're going to come to a moment like that as well, where there's a sense of exhaustion, of failure. We swung and tried for, in our country, Barack Obama. We then went and said Donald Trump was going to really shake it up. And I think people realize, and now we've got bullies on both sides. Once people have the courage to challenge those bullies, we can actually create new systems. And I know you're involved with some young thinkers who are like even rethinking the Constitution, and people in Washington will roll your eyes at that, like, oh yeah, why don't you go play Risk and Stratego or something? I mean, it's a game. No, you have to imagine a new future before you can get there. But you do need, and this is more my conservative side, what are the practical steps that could lead to the change? And that's where I'm most interested. I'm only sort of interested in the strategy, but it does take creative, smart people, visionaries, to imagine something different. But I'm amazed how much in life things can change once that's done. So I do think we need a whole different way of, and we can do it incrementally. We can do it at the local level first. There's all kinds of ways to make it happen, but there are very strong forces in place right now who benefit by the system, and they have strong financial interests. And I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I'm just saying the reality of my city, Washington. I know it very well, and we have crony capitalism in Washington, where very wealthy companies can spend a lot of money on lobbyists to change one piece of legislation, and you don't even know what's going on, and keep things the way they are. Maybe the perfect example right now is that you have Facebook saying to the Congress, please regulate us. And they're running ads. And it's such a charade because they know, one, that they're paying huge lobbying firms to make sure that things get stuck. And the second thing they know is if there are changes to be made, they will be holding the table so that any innovators who come into the social media space will not be in the room. So it will actually reinforce what they have. So that's kind of the challenge that we're facing. And those organizations, it's not like, the cigarette companies in the past. These are all presenting themselves as progressive organizations doing social good. And they're operating in very much a robber baron way from the past.
It's a very interesting tension. On the one hand, all these forces that benefit from the system not changing and can even disguise themselves as, let's say, pseudo-progressive entities in order to maintain the status quo. And on the other hand, this fact that you alluded to, which is it never changes until it changes, and it can unexpectedly change at any moment. And very often that comes down to whether there's an exciting person, an exciting candidate. And nobody was really excited about Joe Biden. They kind of told themselves a story that he was electable, and even then he didn't beat Trump by very much. It seems like there were two exciting candidates, and that was Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And if Bernie Sanders had been able to get through the Democratic primary and win, some people argue he legitimately lost, other people argue he was institutionally sabotaged. Mm-hmm. But assuming he'd won, from a conservative perspective, what would it have taken for Bernie Sanders to win in the general election?
Great question. I personally think that, just my personal opinion, is that Biden was the only one that could have won that election, and that if he could pass at any time, I don't mean that in a negative way. He's just an older person, so. But once he's out of the picture, I think Democrats will have a house of cards collapsing, to be honest. But let's just, if you want to play out how he could.
Yeah. Imagine an alternative Bernie where you change a couple of things about him.
Oh, that's a very good steel man, titanium man challenge. How can I best? I think if he could, he would have needed to. He comes from a conservative state, in a sense, Vermont, and we all think it's just South of Canada and a liberal state. But where it really became clear is when his issue on guns, for example, and progressives never got it. But he was from a rural state, and they just didn't understand that gun culture because they lived in cities. I think if he could have taken issues like that and said, "Look, I've lived with very conservative people. I've taken my hits on guns, and I understand the complexity of things." And I'm in many ways a traditional guy. It's just that I want to move this thing forward. And I think that you'll agree that the banks and and that populist message about the banks and the corporations that are out to get it, I would have his whole thing that it's the rich, we've got to tax the rich, and they're the problem. I think that would be a poison pill. Personally, I know that progressives don't agree with that, but I think saying, that people becoming financially successful is the American dream, and poor people in the United States look at that and say, that could be me. And if not me, maybe I could buy a couple more car dealerships. I could buy a car dealership, or maybe I could get a job. Someday I could go to school and I could get a job at a big company, and maybe even, have a second car. Everybody's asked that. That's kind of what made America work, is that they could see people moving up. That's not the case so much now. But blaming it on the very rich, I think I would have edited that rhetoric out, and he would have had to explain what he would do to bring people together. His positions were pretty much how to, it was just against. But he would have to speak, what's his unifying message that if he won? That's, I think, how, if I were coaching him, I don't know that he'd be particularly open to that. And I think if he had run against Trump, Trump would have won, honestly. But then that's a whole nother imagination of what if Bernie won? If Bernie won, and I would predict that would have been the best thing actually for the Republican Party, because it would swing back very quickly into power in a dominant way. So it's hard to say, but that's kind of how I would play it out in my head. I think that the conservative Black community of South Carolina is very conservative and very practical. And they said, we're not playing games here. We're not reelecting Trump. We're going to pick Biden. And they picked Biden. And I think it's given our country a respite. That's the best I can say about the Biden administration. It is a respite from what we had. And that's a good thing. And I credit the Black community in South Carolina for their sophistication, because I think that anybody else would have lost.
I think one of the things people liked, about Bernie was a sense of authenticity about him. And I'm curious kind of from the conservative perspective, because there's a sense in which at least Republicans, not quite the same as conservatives, denounce anything the Democrats do as socialism. Mm-hmm. And to hear one go, yeah, I'm a socialist, or to hear one go, yeah, I'm going to raise taxes. Mm-hmm. Is that, does that seem refreshing to a conservative? Like at least he's owning it? Or does it seem like proof that it's as terrible as you imagined it might be?
Well, I think it kind of operates at two levels. At one level, one thing that drives most American conservatives is a fear of moving to a socialist state. So we kind of think our secret sauce is that we're not that we're capitalism, and that's our secret sauce. So Bernie would be that would not be something that would excite them. I think the authenticity issue is a glimmer of hope in a way that everybody's craving authenticity now. We've all been marinated in a culture of, particularly if you're young, you've been marketed to since you were a baby. And I think people are just so desperate. So there was a feeling in a way that one of the most ironic things about Trump was the number of people who said, I don't like him, but he is authentic. Like he is who he is, and he doesn't back down. And when the press tries to cower him, the liberal media, he says absurd things that I think are politically incorrect, things I don't agree with, but boy, do I like that he is not kowtowing to the elite narrative. And I think at that level, people are very much looking for authenticity. And I think everybody could respect. I think you would say like our current vice president, I would say on a scale of authenticity is very low. And I don't think she inspires any of that. But a Bernie or an Andrew Yang, maybe sometimes a Pete Buttigieg, they were authentic people. There was some authenticity that came through, but particularly Yang and Bernie. And, voting for authenticity for its own sake, for someone who's Donald Trump, I would say is a disastrous choice, a decision. I understand it. I have many, many friends in that camp. I understand it. And I understand what they're voting against and so on and so forth. So just authenticity, just someone who, someone in your life who tells politically incorrect jokes. And there's something to that. They're not, where you stand. We all have a person in our life, or many, who are very direct and often offensive. And I've always enjoyed those people because I know where I stand and there's no bullshit and they're authentic. So I kind of, for me, I have a high tolerance for that. I'd rather just people be who they want to be. And I have a very low tolerance for policing what people say. But the extreme would be with those two candidates, socialism or Trumpism, Trump populism. I'm very, as a conservative, suspicious of populism. And I don't find it conservative. I find it generally dangerous. And so my alerts go off when you're authentic about that. It's I would say it's not good news. What's the silver lining in this is that if a kind of a spiritually evolved person who was absolutely authentic came along and really did care, and you could feel it and see it in their eyes, and they really did want to solve things, and they were humble and said, I don't have all the answers, but I'll do the best. And they seem very capable. I think that person is going to emerge, and they might either you're going to redefine a party or create something new. But when that comes, we'll all be so exhausted with the false choice between authenticity and a quality person. So,
how are you doing for time? Can we keep this going a little bit longer? Okay. Mm-hmm. Trump is very interesting, and I wouldn't put him in charge of anything, but there are a lot of qualities I like about him as a character. And certainly, like you're saying, he has a kind of comical authenticity, and maybe that's just because he's unable to conceal himself. I don't know. But in addition to those personal qualities, I'm curious what you think he saw about the American people in this historical moment. What did Trump correctly perceive that other institutional politicians missed?
Yeah, well, one funny thing is, back when I was very politically active in the 90s, I did meet him briefly at Atlantic City for a Republican event. And I just thought, my God, we need more of these businesslike Republicans who are just so pro-gay. And of course, I was dead wrong. But that's kind of how I first viewed him, like just a business guy. And I liked Republican business people were always my best audience. They were just like, tell me what we need to do to win. And I don't care who people sleep with. So I kind of saw him in that light. I think if you go back and watch him say on Oprah in the 80s and 90s and so forth, he's ranting about Japan and trade and America losing. So the idea that he just completely concocted a persona for the moment, that's not true. I think he's held a lot of those views. And I've certainly heard those viewpoints my whole life from certain parts of both the left and the right, but mainly we're losing, that feeling that we're losing globally. What he is very good at, in one article I wrote for Quillette, I described him as a bat that sends out a sonar message and he can tell right where the wall is, he knows exactly. So what he didn't do, which I would recommend for anybody running, he didn't hire Washington political consultants. Their mealy-mouthed policy issues are so, I am deep in it, and as soon as I hear it, I want to go to sleep. It's so boring. What he did do is he listened to conservative talk radio. As an entertainer himself, he started listening to things. And then what he did was he listened to talk radio for a couple of years. He probably didn't care that much, honestly, about immigration in the way that he made it an issue, but he kept hearing it from working people. And then he would try things out like a comedian who tries a joke out. And then when the audience laughed, kind of like a child at some level too, to be honest, because, they giggle and laugh at these politically correct things, and he'd keep that one in, cut that one out. And that's kind of how he honed his message. Again, in a culture now that is exhausted with fake reality. When he insulted John McCain, that was a heresy. You don't do that. You don't ever insult military, or talk about Mexicans the way he did in his first speech. He would be done. The fact that he wasn't, it was not an accident. He was honing those messages, and he was listening to what people wanted. And in a field of dozens of people running, he also found a way to jump out. He was the story. The other thing that he also knew that the other people didn't was that the media, 24 news stations, crave that. They're as diabolical at some level as the social media platforms, because they are completely driven by like a crisis, anything that will drive viewership, and that's more outrageous. So after every debate, after everything, he would use those lines. They would then reinforce it by having him on their show the next day. And he used that as a very clever, very cheap marketing platform to continually to grow. So I think, to your question, there's some authentic issues he believed about trade and business, and people saw a lot of it as a racial dog whistle. He also had dog whistles, which is when you say something that's not evident to the rich in our country. I had many progressive millionaire friends of mine. I don't have lots of them, but like they were just like, if he's going to change that tax, do you realize what that will be to me? And I'm like, I can't imagine. I don't understand it. But a little tiny percentage change in a capital gains or a tax code was millions of dollars in some cases for businesses and for very wealthy people who would never tell you they would have supported that. But he was signaling to a lot of different audiences things, and he was very beneficial to the very wealthy. So there was a lot of he had a number of different messages that went out, and he used the slapstick comedy of his authenticity and insults in a politically correct culture to troll the left. He literally, because the left is so sanctimonious, it's so easy to piss them off that he could just pick something, kind of poke at it, and he knew he'd get days and days of coverage on it. So that's how he successfully did it. The morality of all that is a completely different story, but that's, I think, the mechanics.
Earlier, you were mentioning the phenomenon of people being willing to reverse their views because of Trump and turn on things they used to support if Trump speaks favorably of those things. There's a sense that a lot of people have, and maybe this is more common on the left, that you can't associate with somebody who you find to be dangerous and offensive. And if they're in favor of something, you have to be against it, and that you shouldn't work with or receive support from anybody who you think has dangerous views or engages in intolerable behavior, because you're encouraging them. You're emboldening the terrorists by doing it. Is there some truth to that people are encouraged in bad behavior by working with them? Or is that a position that comes out of a weakness and an inability to figure out how to profitably operate with other people?
Well, it's a great question. Again, you were asking some really great questions. I don't mean to keep saying that, but I would say that is a very tough moral position. I had many, many friends confronting that, particularly lifelong Republican politicos, who at a point in their career when Trump won and he offered them a position in their administration, and they had to make that choice. And my general advice, again, not very politically correct, was you have an obligation to go in it. You can go in and do it. And then at one point, I was invited to be on an advisory board in the administration and on HIV/AIDS, and the person called me. And I was very divided because I would love to have been a resource on that topic. And so I was like, okay, I'll go with it. And I also was hoping against hope, against my best hope, that maybe the presidency would change the person, that maybe he could, if he's going to put all these traditional folks around him, many of whom I know, there's some barriers. That was not true. But in any case, at the end of a call where I was being asked to be on this advisory board, they said, we really are excited to have people who support the president. And I just said, you just need to know I am outspokenly, and as you look at my record, I've been out speaking against this president since the primary. I called him a bully after New Hampshire and a dangerous person. So, and the guy was like, well, you can still be objective in your decision, in your advice and all that. And I said, I would absolutely be objective. That's my nature. But I don't know that I'd be supporting the president. I'd be doing this as a public service, as a citizen, as a loyal American. And I care about the topic. And so then that killed that. But that, at least I talked to a number of people who I work at a firm. That would have been a political nightmare. I would have suffered greatly if something like that had happened and I'd be associated with it. But on a basis, I think you do have to work with people. As a conservative, when I'm doing strategy, my first goal is let's get the reality of the situation. Like, what is really going on here? Not fantasy, not what we hope it is, not ideological, like what's really going on. So I work in a lot of, a big issue I work on is poverty reduction. And long story short, the Trump administration moved something that would make it a very good investment in cities that were destroyed, called opportunity zones. And it's legislation I've long supported. It had bipartisan support, but it was a Trump initiative. And I remember being invited by Trump team members to the Trump Hotel, close to where I live, to meet at the restaurant to talk about ways we could work together. And again, it was very, very, I had very mixed feelings about it. I had mixed feelings about being in the hotel, to be honest. And at the same time, I was like, if I have an opportunity to really transform poverty in a lot of cities, and this was a very clever tax benefit, and I knew it would work because it was, somewhat selfish and somewhat good, which is the best kind. And I was like, so I did some initial meetings. I did a whole, luncheon on opportunity zones. And I had the person who created it from the Trump administration come and speak where he wouldn't speak anywhere else because they trusted me. So it's, you're in that space, but, I don't think it's like, everybody was interesting. Everybody compared it during that time to Nazi Germany. And I have a cousin who's a famous pastor who opposed Hitler, who is like a complete role model for me. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a German theologian who opposed Hitler, was eventually executed. And so his writings, theological writings, are extremely important to me. And I was trying to do left-right dialogue at my church, and I spoke to ministers, and they said, we're in a Bonhoeffer moment. We cannot, on the left, they would say, we cannot speak to the Nazis as they're rising, they're burning the Reichstag, they're taking over, they're going to put us in camps. And you want us to go talk to Hitler. You think you're going to work it out. We're not doing it. And then it was interesting when I would speak to evangelical Christian leaders that I knew, they would say, we're in a Bonhoeffer moment. He's someone who transcends both sides. And they said, if we don't stop the progressive movement, we will end up in camps. This is our last bulwark against socialism and communism and the elite left. So yeah, and I don't want to talk to people. So that's so I am not in either of those camps. I think it's always an opportunity to talk. I'll talk with almost anybody. I'll work with almost anybody, and I'll understand the complexity. Now, when you get to the point where you're really working with pure evil, it's not good for you. You better be a brilliant strategist that you're going to come out with a win. Evil people tend to destroy everybody in the process, so you just have to be aware of that. But we were not Nazi Germany. That's the thing I kept telling people. This is not Nazi Germany. That's not what's going on here, and this is an opportunity. So it's a very complex decision-making process, but I'm generally open and criticized by both sides. Like, why do you spend so much time on left-wing causes? Would be a criticism from the right. And on the left, why do you still retain yourself as a conservative when you're in a party that has been taken over by Donald Trump? I live with those tensions. I realize those tensions, but the tensions actually work for me because they increase my complexity and allow me to be more versatile in strategy.
I'm glad you brought up Bonhoeffer because I'd love to pivot to religion and spirituality, which is my primary area of interest. And I'm curious what early things in your life helped you to get intrigued about religion. Was it just a feature of your social environment? Was it a deep existential longing? Did you have mystical experiences you needed an interpretation for? What drew you into religion?
Well, thanks for asking. I was spiritually precocious. My ancestors are in a faith called Swedenborgianism, which is Christian mysticism. and they were some of the early founders in Germany and early writers and founders in the United States. So I have this long tradition in Swedenborgianism, which is very fascinating. Because there were no churches near where I grew up in an American Baptist church nearby and went through Sunday school and went through a whole evangelical upbringing, which I'm incredibly grateful for. Again, it's given me a whole different language and a knowledge of the Bible that I'm super grateful for. But by 16, I was preaching in the church, and but I was asking questions. I didn't, particularly around the atonement of Christ on the cross and the blood and the death didn't make any sense. And also, it's exclusivism. We had a pamphlet in the front of the church. Are the pagans saved? And then you open it up, capital N-O, no, the cross over it. So I was like, and not only did I learn that the pagans weren't saved, but actually the Catholics and the Jews in my neighborhood probably were not saved, and probably the liberal Christians were not saved. So it was just us, and that was great, just us. So you better show up because you're with the elect. So I kind of grew up in that culture, and it's, I think our lives go through those levels of development on the integral spiral, and there's a spiritual level to it too. So I'm glad I went through deeply traditional level, because I do deeply understand it. It's been incredibly helpful. Then I went to study philosophy. I'm one of 6 kids, so we all picked a state college in Pennsylvania. I studied philosophy. Only 3 people studied philosophy at my state college in the Pocono Mountains. And then by literally a miracle, I don't really understand how it quite happened. But anyway, I got right into Harvard Divinity School. So I went to get my master's of divinity. And during that time, I realized the American Baptist faith there was not much gas in that engine for me. And I went back and I kept asking my dad questions. And he's like, read your grandfather's book. So I really went in depth on Swedenborg and fell in love with Swedenborg's insights and understandings and Christian mysticism. And I've had a series my whole life of mystical experiences, epiphanies, not explainable, fascinating, but really important guideposts. So I've just been on a spiritual path the whole time. And it was during that time, during theological school, that a book came out that we were studying by James Fowler on religious levels of experience, sort of like an integral theory of faith. And Swedenborg, as a Christian mystic, had a whole complete spiritual evolutionary theology, including where the book of the story of the 7 days of creation are 7 days of spiritual growth. The story of the Bible is the story of our lives. And the Bible has to be read at a spiritual level, not just a literal level. And so I was sort of into that stage development space back in the 80s and fascinated by it. I didn't know anything about integral theory or spiral dynamics. So I've been fascinated by that. Long story short was that I looked at the Swedenborgians as an ordination path, and they had no future as I could see. Their churches were dying and they were very unknown. No one knows them. And I got ordained American Baptist. I became the assistant pastor at the Memorial Church, which is Harvard's chapel. So I had Jesse Jackson and Prince Charles and Bishop Tutu and all the great preachers who come to this church. And it was just a fantastic experience. And I had a great mentor, and Peter Gomes was the chaplain. So that was a fantastic spiritual path. Then I was also coming out of the closet. And I remember at that time I said, I'm definitely gay. I've known it for a long time. Boston was a great place. Cambridge was a great place to come out in the 80s. And I said, but everybody said to me, if you're going to go with the minister route, get a wife. If you're going to come out, find a new career, become a lawyer. So I did come out. I did kind of cut that path off, and accidentally or serendipitously, I'd like to think, I moved into a political sphere. And so then I moved into politics. Then I moved into, kind of global strategy and coaching. I do a lot of coaching, and I'm very involved in the social enterprise space, which I thought might be the next evolution of spirituality. And now I've come full circle. I did transfer my ordination to Swedenborgian, and I'm now pastoring a Swedenborgian church, which I'm using as a spiritual entrepreneur incubator where you develop your inner life, but we also match you up to your business or political life. And we do both together. And I get people who are either very spiritual, very nonprofit-y, but they have no idea how to do a business or do politics. Or I get people on the other side who are, Enneagram 3s, top of their game in DC, but they're completely disconnected from their heart. They literally, they're really materialist, reductionist, and they're trying to find they're trying to get some path back to a soul or a spirit, and we can take them in that direction too. So that's, I've come full circle, and then Swedenborgianism is definitely Christian mysticism, but it's a spiritual evolutionary theology that is, I'm just constantly learning and enjoying, and I enjoy preaching and so forth at a church again.
Spiritual entrepreneurship, interesting opportunity and interesting tension there. How do you approach it in a way that takes seriously the kind of ancient religious observation that there's a danger of spirituality being eroded by the marketplace or being poisoned by the very virtues we associate with entrepreneurial activity?
I would say that, at least in all the spiritual traditions that I've studied, or the ones I know better, I would say basically the greater danger is to pontificate a spiritual belief and not engage in the world. In other words, to exclude yourself from the world, not deal with anybody you don't want to deal with, don't create a business, don't create a cause, just be in your world, be right, and grow spiritually. I don't think it's like saying I'm going to develop my body, but I'm never going to lift a weight. I'm not going to do anything that's active. You can't do it. So spirituality for me is a mix of both an inner path and constantly going deeper, hopefully more kind, hopefully more humble, hopefully more peaceful. And at the same time, it's greater degrees of complexity. So I spend a lot of time in my day learning how to do LLCs and C Corps and investments and things that are really outside of my mind. My mind is quite limited when it comes to mathematics. But I'm teaching business plans and I'm teaching political strategies, because if you want to change the world for the better, you must understand the vehicles to accomplish it. You can't just talk about it. So many of the people that I work with on the spiritual side, particularly fellow ministers, are in a great deal of pain and sadness because they feel called to do good in the world, and they have no one ever told them how to run a board meeting or how to raise money, or how to pay their bills. There's usually a poverty aspect they've kind of made into it. So when I'm dealing, most of the kind of spiritual work side, people I deal with are kind of progressive spirituality. They are offended by the word entrepreneur, just to your point. They're like, I don't want to be measuring anything by impact or money. That conversation usually goes to, do you feel like you have enough to retire? Do you feel like you have enough to pay your bills? And then it's a resentfulness. No, I really resent the fact that I've done this good path of spirituality, and I'm broke, and I'm begging rich people who do terrible things for money from their foundations. So when you really dig down a little deeper, they're like, I think I deserve a lifestyle. Nobody I know is looking for to get rich, but they would certainly like to live a life without the stress of finances. So actually, that is mitigated fairly quickly. The other side is more difficult. If you're financially very successful, I noticed this during COVID, people would approach me and just say, like, I'm not my office, I'm not my title, I'm not my parking spot, I'm not doing the meetings. Like, who am I if I'm not that? And that was a very common question I got. And that person will, when they call for coaching, I say, we'll coach, but you're riding the bike up the hill, and very, very likely you're going to turn around again at some point. It's so much easier to go on the path you're going. It means you probably won't sleep well and you won't have good mental health. But the spiritual path is a tough thing when you're so embedded in the material path. So I find it on both sides, but I feel like, I always say, we're all called to love God. The only way you can love God is to love your neighbor. That's the only practical way. So it's not, I try to move anything from abstraction. So you say you want to change the world. What practical things are you doing in the world to make that happen? And some people's role is, right, the monk or, the academic, but too many people travel in that because they don't want to get their hands dirty in this world of compromise and complexity. And so I feel like the real spiritual life is being totally engaged in the world, and to shift, earlier talking about different voting systems. In the back of my mind, my secret strategies, I think there will be a spiritual evolution Okay, I think that God is at work in the world, and I don't trust it to us. And good spiritual leaders are going to be called up and given skills. I can't explain in my own life how I've been given opportunities that I've been given, and I can't take credit for it. And there's just, if I explained it, you just say that doesn't make any sense. So I'm actually counting on a spiritual support for there to be evolution, for good things to happen next in the world, politically, and in the business world.
When you think of God, what is it that you think of? How would you describe that without using the word God? Like, what is it like that you think of?
Generally, this is cliche, love, maybe love and wisdom as a combination. I've been struck by that. That's a important coupling in our faith, and I've been struck by how compassion and truth play out in the world. And I think that in my experience in politics, the left is more compassion without truth very often. And I think the right, my side, is generally true, but very often compassion-less. And so I'm looking for that balance where you are really compassionate and loving and you have truth. And I see God as that kind of that combination. But generally, I just allow myself to stop. Like I say, I'm not going to spend too much time on God, because it is everything. We're all part of it. So that's kind of that. It's a very cosmic view of it. It's I believe that anybody who is making decisions to love their neighbor and not hate people is on a path toward that, regardless of what they call it. Atheists, secular people have been some of the most Christ-like spiritual people I've met in my life. At the same time, people who can espouse theology in great detail have been some of the most hellish energies that I've encountered. So I don't think it really matters so much what you say. It's really what you do and where you get your knowledge to move forward personally.
There are so many other things I could ask in areas we could go into, but I don't think we can ask listeners to stay with us for more than 2 hours. Maybe we'll have another chance to talk.
You asked the most amazing questions. I'm happy to join you anytime. I really appreciate the depth of the questions, which I do not usually get asked in a day or ever. So I really appreciated that.
Well, true. Maybe I'll think of an excuse for us to have a talk again. And I look at myself and I think I'm young enough to hate old people, but old enough to hate young people. And there's that in-between role there where I think I can, in part, model the veneration of the legitimate elders in our community, which includes yourself, not to say you're over the hill or anything, because one of the things about being an elder seems to be that your growth and energy continues and makes somebody worthy of paying attention to and caring about the experiences and wisdom they've acquired in their life. So thank you for that.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for being a role model for so many and a mentor for so many.